Chapter 3. Learning and Theories of Learning. Definition, Characteristics, and Principles of Learning. Definitions of learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior occurring as a result of experience or practice. Characteristics of learning. Learning is continuous modification of behavior throughout life. Learning is pervasive, it reaches into all aspects of human life. Learning involves the whole person, socially, emotionally and intellectually. Learning is often a change in the organization of experiences. Learning is responsive to incentives. Learning is an active process. Learning is purposeful. Learning depends on maturation, motivation, and practice. Learning is multifaceted. Factors influencing learning. Motivation. Maturation. A health condition. Psychological well-being, anxiety, fear, self-confidence, good working conditions. Theories of learning and their applications. There are three major theories of learning. 1. Behaviorist theory, Pavlov, Skinner, Thorndike. 2. Social learning, Albert Bandura. 3. Cognitive learning, Jean Piaget. Behavioral theory of learning. V. Learning from stimulus-response associations. VIT emphasizes observable behaviors. Think back. The definition of psych. V focuses on consequences. V. Behaviorists differ on the role of reinforcement in learning. Thus, there are two major behavioral theories of learning. 1. Classical conditioning, formulated by Ivan Pavlov. 2. Operant conditioning, formulated Boris Frederick, B.F. Skinner. Classical conditioning theory. Classical conditioning focuses on the learning of involuntary emotional or physiological responses to stimuli that normally elicit no response, e.g. fear, increased heartbeat, salivation or sweating. Classical conditioning is a type of learning in which a neutral stimulus comes to bring about a response after it is paired with a stimulus that naturally brings about that response. Classical conditioning, continued. Basics of classical condition. 1. Neutral stimulus, a stimulus that, before conditioning, does not naturally bring about the response of interest. 2. Unconditioned stimulus, UCS, a stimulus that naturally brings about a particular response without having been learned. 3. Unconditioned response, UCR, a response that is natural and needs no training, example salivation at the smell of food. Basics. 4. Conditioned stimulus, CS, neutral stimulus that paired with an unconditioned stimulus to bring about a response similar with the unconditioned stimuli. 5. Conditioned response, CR, a response that follows a previously neutral stimulus. Classical conditioning, continued. Hence, the theory of classical conditioning represents a process in which a neutral stimulus, by pairing with a natural stimulus, acquires all the characteristics of natural stimulus. It is also called substitution learning. B/C. It involves substituting a neutral stimulus in place of natural stimulus. Let us consider Pavlov's experiment. Summary. Summary of classical conditioning procedure. A. Before conditioning food, UCS, salivation, UCR, bell, NS, no salivation. B. During conditioning, bell plus food, salivation, NS plus UCS, UCRC. After conditioning, bell, salivation, CSCR. Principles of classical condition. 1. Extinction, presenting the CS repeatedly without the UCS, meet, the CR. Will diminish and eventually stop. 2. Spontaneous recovery is the re-emergence of an extinguished conditioned response after extinction. 3. Stimulus generalization is a process in which, after a stimulus has been conditioned to produce a particular response, Stimuli that are similar to the original stimulus begin to produce the same responses. Stimulus generalization happens when an organism learns a response to one stimulus and applies it to another similar stimulus. Even though the stimuli may be different, the familiarity that accompanies the initial learning can be applied to other stimuli as well. Stimulus generalization enables organisms to take previous learning and apply it to new, but similar, situations. The ability to utilize previous learning keeps the organism from having to start over in the learning process. Generalizations can be less effective when the stimulus has an element of newness unassociated with the familiarity. For example, when a person learns to drive a car, this training can be generalized to driving most other cars. If the initial training was on an automatic transmission, though, and now the driver must drive a manual transmission, generalization of the prior skills is limited. The respondent must then use stimulus discrimination to distinguish between the familiar and the new information, and make the appropriate adjustments to generalize the new learning. Stimulus discrimination is the process of distinguishing two similar stimuli, the ability to differentiate between stimuli. Note that extinction would prove to be a useful psychological finding to treat phobias and other irrational fears. The following summary can help make the relationships between stimuli and responses easier to understand and remember. O conditioned equals learned. O unconditioned equals not learned. O an unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. O unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response pairings are unlearned and untrained. O during conditioning, a previously neutral stimulus is transformed into the conditioned stimulus. O a conditioned stimulus leads to a conditioned response, and a conditioned stimulus, conditioned response pairing is a consequence of learning and training. O an unconditioned response and a conditioned response are similar, such as salivation in Pavlov's experiment, but the unconditioned response occurs naturally, whereas the conditioned response is learned. Operant/instrumental conditioning. O operant conditioning, learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or weakened, depending on its favorable or unfavorable consequences. O operant conditioning states that learning occurs as a result of the rewards and punishments the subject receives in response to a particular behavior. O if the result of the behavior is a reward, the same behavior is likely to be repeated. O if the result is a punishment, the behavior is less likely to be repeated. It states that learning occurs as a result of voluntary responses that are operating in the environment. These behavioral responses are either strengthened, more likely to recur, or weakened, less likely to recur, depending on whether the consequences of the response are favorable or unfavorable. Unlike classical conditioning, which depends on the biological responses, operant conditioning applies to voluntary responses, which an organism deliberately performs in order to achieve a desired outcome. When operant a behavior operates on the environment in ways that produce consequences. Example: if a person is playing the piano, that person is operating on the environment, the keys on the piano, in such a way as to produce music. The quality of the music and comments from listeners are the consequences that condition the person's operant performance at the piano. Well-played music elicits social approval that reinforces the skills needed. Operant. O operant conditioning is learning in which a voluntary response is strengthened or weakened, depending on its favorable or unfavorable consequences. It is a form of association learning in which the consequences of behavior produce changes in the probability of the behavior's occurrence. Also known as instrumental conditioning because it is instrumental in changing the environment and producing consequences. In operant conditioning, the organism's response operates on the environment and the environment, in turn, operates the organism's response. Basic operations. As Skinner's analysis, a response, operant, can lead to three types of consequences: 1, a neutral consequence; 2, a reinforcement; or 3, punishment. 1. A neutral consequence that does not alter the response; 2. A reinforcement that strengthens the response by a reinforcer. Basic operations. 1. Reinforcement. A reinforcer is any event that increases the probability that the behavior that precedes it will be repeated. Reinforcers are the prime movers of operant conditioning. Reinforcers that follow an operant behavior increase the likelihood, reoccurrence, a similar response, behavior, in the future. There are two basic types of reinforcers. Primary reinforcers: food, water, light, stroking of the skin, and a comfortable air. Temperature. Secondary reinforcers: money, praise, applause, good grades, awards, and gold stars. Basic operations. Both primary and secondary reinforcers can be positive or negative. A positive reinforcement is the process whereby presentation of a stimulus makes behavior more likely to occur again. A positive reinforcer is a stimulus added to the environment that brings about an increase in a preceding response. For instance, if food, water, money, praise, or any number of other stimuli follow a particular response, it is very likely that this response will occur again in the future. A positive reinforcement can be given in natural or artificial ways. Natural praise and artificial rewards are not very effective in reinforcing behavior. A negative reinforcement is the process whereby elimination of an aversive stimulus makes behavior more likely to occur. A negative reinforcer refers to an unpleasant stimulus whose removal from the environment leads to an increase in the probability that a preceding response will occur again in the future. Two main classes of behavior produced by negative reinforcement are escape and avoidance. Escape responses are those operants that allow a person to get away from aversive stimuli after the stimuli are present. Avoidance responses are those operants that allow a person to prevent the occurrence of aversive stimuli before the aversive stimuli appear. In other words, escape involves reacting after an aversive event is present. Avoidance involves proacting or taking preventative steps before an aversive event arises. People react to getting a splinter in their finger by pulling it out; they proact by putting on gloves before handling rough wood. Escape behaviors are usually learned before avoidance behaviors. Examples. 1. For example, if someone nags you all the time to study, but stops nagging when you comply, your studying is likely to increase, e.g. escape learning, avoidance learning too. An example of escaping could involve a married couple who repeatedly find themselves in verbal arguments with each other. They react by trying to escape the aversive situation through marital counseling. 3. Other couples who see their friends having marital troubles may proact by working on improving their communication and resolving differences before problems arise, thereby avoiding some arguments and possible long-term damage to their marriage. Generally, better to understand as: there are two kinds of reinforcement, positive and negative. To reinforce means to strengthen, thus, both positive and negative reinforcement strengthen behavior. i.e., both increase the likelihood that a subject will repeat the behavior in the future. The critical difference between the two is that positive reinforcement occurs with the addition of a reinforcing stimulus. Negative reinforcement consists of removing an aversive stimulus. 2. Puniment. When an operant behavior is followed by a response that reduces the frequency of a similar response in the future, that stimulus is called punishment. If a person receives a significant fine after driving through a red light, the punishment is likely to reduce the tendency to speed through red lights in the future. Punishment produces the fastest reduction of the behavior when it is strong, immediate, and not opposed by reinforcement. There are two types of punishment, positive punishment and negative punishment, just as there are both positive and negative reinforcement. In both cases, the term positive refers to something that is added, whereas negative implies something that is removed. Explanation: positive and negative. The terms positive and negative indicate whether punishment occurs with the onset or termination of the stimulus that follows the operant. Positive indicates onset, and negative indicates termination. Positive punishment occurs when the onset of an aversive stimulus suppresses behavior. For instance, if you spill hot coffee on your hand while carrying a cup to a nearby table, the onset of an aversive stimulus, hot coffee, punishes the clumsy act. This is considered a positive form of punishment. Negative punishment occurs when the termination of a rewarding stimulus suppresses behavior. If a haphazard action results in your dropping and losing an important document, the loss serves as punishment for the act. Therefore, the loss of a positive reinforcer is a negative punishment. Negative reinforcement and punishment. It is important to distinguish between negative reinforcement and punishment. The two are not the same in operant conditioning. Punishment refers to a stimulus that decreases the probability that a prior behavior will occur again. This differs from negative reinforcement, which increases the likelihood of a recurrence in the behavior. Punishment does not cause behavior to be unlearned or forgotten. It merely suppresses the frequency of responding. Often the effects of punishment are only temporary. When the punishment no longer occurs, the rate of responding usually increases. This phenomenon is called recovery. Recovery is fastest and most complete when the original punishment was mild or infrequent and there is reinforcement for reinstating the behavior. The milder the original punishment, the sooner a behavior is likely to recover after the end of punishment. Positive punishment weakens a response or makes it less likely to recur through the application of an unpleasant stimulus. On the same track, but coming from the opposite direction, is negative punishment. This consists of removing something that is pleasant in order to weaken the response or make it less likely to be repeated. Although Skinner recognized the role of punishment in response to behavior, he was against using it because he did not believe it had a permanent effect in altering behavior except in extreme cases. Although it may initially stop the particular behavior in question, Skinner believed that the prior response was likely to reappear over time. In addition, punishment may actually cause a resulting fear or anxiety to emerge that wasn't present before the application of the punishment. Note: punishment is a stimulus that weakens the response or makes it less likely to recur. It is an undesirable event that follows a behavior it intends to reduce/weaken. Punishers can also be primary or secondary. Primary punishers, pain and extreme heat or cold. Secondary punishers, criticism, demerits, catcalls, scolding, fines, and bad grades. The pros and cons of punishment. Immediacy. Punishment follows immediately after the behavior to be punished. Consistency. Using punishment evenly/steadily. Intensity. Use severe punishments. The pros and cons. Continued: when punishment fails, you administering punishment inappropriately or mindlessly, your recipient of punishment often responds with anxiety, fear, or rage, depending heavily on the presence of the punishing person or circumstances. Hard to punish immediately. A punishment conveys little information, instead of punishing it may be reinforcing because it brings attention. 3 schedules of reinforcement. Oskiner discovered that reinforcement need not be given for each response, but instead could be given after some number of responses according to various schedules of reinforcement. A schedule of reinforcement refers to the specific relationship between the number, timing, or frequency of responding, and the delivery of the reward. Once a behavior has been shaped, it can be maintained by various patterns of reinforcement. Depending on the particular schedule, the reward may follow the response immediately or have varying degrees of delay. Schedules are among the most powerful determinants of behavior. All reinforcers and punishers are embedded in one schedule or another, and each schedule has its own characteristic effects on behavior. Type of the schedule. Reinforcement can be given for each occurrence of the response or only for some of the responses. The 2 broad categories of schedules are continuous and partial, also called intermittent, reinforcements. With continuous reinforcement, each response of a particular type is reinforced. In a partial reinforcement schedule, only a portion of the response are reinforced. A continuous schedule of reward generally produces more rapid conditioning or a higher level of responding than a partial reinforcement schedule. Though a continuous schedule may condition more rapidly, partial schedules are often more powerful in sustaining the behavior, depending on the interval of reward. Extinction does tend to occur more quickly if a behavior that has received continuous reinforcement is no longer reinforced. There are again 2 broad types of partial reinforcement schedules: interval schedules, which are based on the passage of time, and ratio schedules, which are based on the number of responses. On an interval schedule, the first response made after an interval of time has passed is reinforced. Responses made before that interval of time are not reinforced. There are 2 types of interval schedules, fixed and variable. In a ratio schedule, time is not a factor. Instead, reinforcement is given only after a certain number of responses. Ratio schedules also have 2 types, fixed and variable. Exemplary expression. A fixed interval schedule applies the reinforcer after a specific amount of time. An example might be an employee who gets a raise once at the end of each year but no increase in pay during the course of the year. The reinforcer, increase in pay, comes only at a predetermined time regardless of the employee's work performance during the year. Fixed intervals have built-in problems that manifest in certain situations. Using the example of the employee's end of the year raise, the employee knows when the reinforcement is to come. So he may tend to lower his performance immediately after the reinforcement and tend to increase performance right before the reinforcement period. In fixed, therefore, response rate decrease, immediate after, then increase as it approaches, for the second round. In this case, the employee might improve his performance near the end of the year to look good when it comes time for the review that determines the amount of pay raise. Variable interval. Reinforcement is also controlled by the passage of time in a variable interval schedule. In contrast to the fixed interval, in which the person knows the time the reinforcement will be given, the person does not know when the reinforcement will appear in a variable interval schedule. Exemplary expression, interval. An example of this schedule might be the supervisor who checks an employee's work at irregular intervals. Because the employees never know when such checks will occur, they must perform in a consistent manner in order to obtain positive outcomes, such as praise, or avoid negative ones, such as criticism or loss of their job. A response can be reinforced each time it occurs. A procedure as continuous reinforcement or once a response has become reliable. Reinforcing only some responses, not all of them, a procedure called intermittent, partial, schedule of reinforcement. Other are 4 types of intermittent schedules. 1. Fixed ratio schedules. Reinforcement is determined in a very different manner on a fixed ratio schedule. Here, reinforcement occurs only after a fixed number of responses. For example, some individuals are paid on the basis of how many pieces of goods they produce. A fixed ratio schedule yields a high rate of response, though there is a tendency for brief pauses immediately after reinforcement. 2. Variable ratio schedule. On a variable ratio schedule, reinforcement occurs after completion of a variable number of responses. It is reinforcing a response after some average number of responses, but with varying from reinforcement to reinforcement. Since the person using a variable ratio schedule cannot predict how many responses are required before reinforcement will occur, they usually respond at high and steady rates. Example: the person who repeatedly plays the slot machine knows at some point the machine will have a payoff, but they are not sure when it will occur. The anticipation that it could happen on the next pull compels many to keep playing beyond the point of good reason. Variable ratio schedules also result in behaviors that are highly resistant to extinction. This means that even in the absence of reinforcement, the behavior might persist. In fact, resistance to extinction is much higher after exposure to a variable ratio schedule than to a continuous reinforcement schedule. This would help explain why gambling can be so addictive for certain individuals. 3. Variable ratio schedule, reinforcing a response only after a fixed amount of time has passed. 4. Variable interval schedule, reinforcing a response only after a variable amount of time has passed. Generally, note that fixed ratio schedule, U produces high rate of responding, U sometimes responding drops off just afters, U response is less resistant to extinction equals more exposed to extinction. Variable ration, U produces extremely high steady rate of responding, U response is more resistant to extinction equals the learned behavior is not easily extincted. 4. Shaping. Shaping is a technique that is used in behaviorism to train an organism to perform a behavior that is completely new. Shaping teaches a complex behavior by rewarding or reinforcing each step of the learning process rather than the final outcome. An operant conditioning procedure in which successive approximations of a desired response are reinforced. It is establishing novel behaviors by reinforcing responses that gradually approach the behavior that is desired. The concept of shaping breaks down the learning process into smaller pieces. Shaping, then, helps the organism acquire or construct new and more complex forms of behavior from simpler behavior. By the time shaping is complete, the reinforcement need only be given at the completion of the desired behavior in order for the behavior to recur. Examples for shaping. Textbooks for students are often written using the concept of shaping. Typically, information is presented so that new material builds on previously learned concepts or skills. If this were not the progression, most students would become confused and perhaps abandon the attempt to learn the concepts under study. Chaining. Chaining refers to a type of conditioning that is similar to shaping but requires a more complex sequence of behaviors. This process is referred to as chaining because each response is like a link in the chain. The reward is presented after the entire sequence of behaviors is completed, thus reinforcing the sequence and not the individual behavior. Chains can be trained in the forward direction, that is, by practicing the first response in the chain and then adding successively the next elements. It can also be learned backwards, beginning with the last element and working toward the front. Sometimes the entire chain is learned simultaneously. Examples for chaining. Backward chaining is often used with pilot trainees when using a flight simulator. They practice landings first, followed by landing approaches and then other flight-specific behaviors such as midair maneuvers. The purpose of the backward chaining is that landings are the most difficult behavior to master in the chain, and by starting there, this behavior receives the most practice as the behavioral links are put in place. Forward chaining might be used by physical therapists to teach disabled individuals to transfer themselves from a wheelchair to another chair or bed. Personal note: unlike classical conditioning, in which the original behaviors are the natural, biological responses to the presence of a stimulus such as food, water, or pain, operant conditioning applies to voluntary responses, which an organism performs deliberately to produce a desirable outcome. The term operant emphasizes this point: the organism operates in its environment to produce a desirable result. Operant conditioning is at work when we learn that toiling industriously can bring about a raise, or that studying hard results in good grades. Applications of operant conditioning. Conditioning study behavior, arranging effective contingencies of reinforcement. Example for self-learning: reinforcing a student using incentives such as prize, medal, smile, praise, patting on the back, or giving higher marks. V-conditioning and classroom behavior, acquiring unpleasant experience which becomes conditioned to the teacher, subject and the classroom, and students begin to dislike the subject and the teacher. V. Managing behavioral problem, used as therapy to shape students' behavior by admitting positive contingencies like praise. Applications, continued. V. Dealing with anxieties through conditioning, used to break fear habits using used desensitization technique. Initially provide very weak form of conditioned stimulus, gradually increasing the strength of stimulus. V. Conditioning group behavior, reinforcement breaks undesired and antisocial behavior of a group. Applications of operant conditioning, continued. V. Conditioning and cognitive processes, to bring a progress of knowledge, reinforcing in the feedback form. V. Shaping complex behavior, controlling complex behavior that exist in the form of a chain of small behaviors. Social learning theory, observational learning theory. A tendency for individuals to reproduce the actions, attitudes, or emotional responses displayed by real-life or symbolized models as Bandura. 3 forms of reinforcement can encourage observational learning: direct reinforcement, reproduce the behaviors of the model; vicarious reinforcement, self-reinforcement. Processes of social learning. Bandura mentions 4 conditions that are necessary in the processes of observational learning. 1. Attention, paying attention to the model. 2. Retention, encoding and storing of observed behavior in memory. 3. Motor reproduction, replicating the observed behavior. 4. Motivation, the desire to demonstrate, perform, the learned behavior frequently. Implications of social learning theory. Learning occurs through observing other people describing the consequences of behavior to increase appropriate behaviors and decrease inappropriate ones. Provides an alternative to shaping for teaching new behaviors, taking care to model appropriate behaviors but not inappropriate behaviors, to break down traditional stereotypes, exposing students to a variety of other models. Implications, continued. To develop a sense of self-efficacy, believe that someone is capable of accomplishing school tasks. To set realistic expectations for academic accomplishments. Helps to improve self-regulation behavior. Cognitive learning theory. Cognitive learning theory, an approach to the study of learning that focuses on the thought processes that underlie learning. These mental processes affect individuals' behavior and personality. This theory deals with the mental mechanisms that mediate the processing of information in some meaningful fashion. It extends into the realms of memory, thinking, problem solving, and the use of language. Forms of cognitive learning. Examples: latent learning, a hidden form of learning in which a behavior is not manifested for the time being. Chapter 4. Memory and forgetting.